The fluorescent lights above the spotless linoleum corridors hummed with the hollow promise of achievement, as if every polished tile and perfectly framed student accolade whispered, "This is a place of order and respect." Yet in the oppressive stillness, you could feel the undercurrent of judgment pulsing beneath the sheen. Here, where lockers stood in regimented rows like sentinels guarding innocence, a single, small figure in a wheelchair rolled through the silent ranks of peers who parted with averted eyes and hurried steps, their hushed murmurs like distant thunder. There he goes again. Did she bring that bird into class? A whisper of exclusion that struck sharper than any roar. Clutched to his side in a battered cage, the teen's parrot preened its feathers, as though unconcerned by the hostile gaze. Its bright eyes reflecting both the boy's hope and the cruelty waiting in the wings. The hall echoed with the faint click of wheelchair spokes, each revolution a quiet rebellion against the suffocating norm. And somewhere down this corridor of facades, a teacher's silhouette appeared, heels clicking a deliberate warning, a cold smile, curving like a trap. The boy's heart pulsed in his ears as he sensed the weight of her stare, a barrage of silent questions. Why are you here? What do you think you deserve? With every slow turn of the wheels, the tension coiled tighter, electricity humming between the walls, and in that charged air, the first drop of water fell from an overhead fountain. A single bead of moisture that glinted like a diamond before it shattered the illusion of safety, heralding the storm that would drown his dignity and scatter his fragile faith in justice. The bell's metallic clang died in the hollow corridor, but its echo lingered like a challenge as the boy wheeled forward, his spine stiff with determination, even as every eye followed him with a mixture of disdain and morbid curiosity. A cluster of jocks snickered behind him, tossing insults under their breath. What a freak show! Guess he thinks this school owes him something. And a girl in a pleated skirt crossed herself theatrically as though warding off evil, her whispered "God help us," carrying the weight of condemnation. The parrot's cage rattled at his side, its frantic squawk a defiant anthem that only fueled the teacher's cruel amusement when she emerged from her classroom doorway, arms folded and lips curled in a smirk that promised retribution. Her voice cut through the murmurs like shattered glass. "Turn that thing down, Harris. This isn't a zoo, and you're not welcome to bring your circus to my classroom." The bird shrieked in protest, flapping its wings against the thin bars, and the boy's throat tightened. He tried to steady his voice, but it trembled as he replied, "It's just my parrot, Miss Carlyle. He's part of my therapy." Laughter rippled through the hallway at the word therapy, hushed giggles fueled by prejudice. "Therapy for what? Being black and broken?" one student whispered so loud the boy heard. Miss Carlyle's eyes glittered with contempt. "Therapy, more like a performance. Why don't you wheel that limp act somewhere else before you disrupt the real students?" She stepped closer, her heels clicking a countdown to humiliation, and without warning grabbed the parrot's cage, wrenching it from his grasp as feathers flew. Like confetti of fear, the boy lunged forward, metal spokes grinding against tile, but she tossed the cage across the hall with such force it slammed into a locker, the bird's sharp cry echoing off the walls as it tumbled out onto the floor. A moment of stunned silence followed before snorts and jeers erupted. "Look at that filthy bird," someone jeered. "Hope it learns to stay away from its master." The boy's cheeks burned hotter than the midday sun outside. He struggled to his feet, hands shaking as he reached for the paralyzed parrot, the cage tumbling aside like a broken promise. Miss Carlyle watched with sculpted calm, arms folded, as though presiding over a lesson in public shaming. The parrot lay still for a heartbeat, eyes glazed with shock, then ruffled its feathers and let out a plaintive cry that split the laughter. The boy scooped it into his arms, tears blurring his vision, and wheeled away down the corridor, where every second became an eternity of stares and whispered slurs. Just another delinquent. Why do we even pretend he belongs here? But behind him, his parrot's breathing steadied, its defiance humming through its small chest like a promise. The fight was only beginning. The door to classroom 302 swung open with a dull thud that echoed like a challenge, and he rolled in, parrot cradled against his chest, wheels clicking over linoleum worn smooth by generations of indifferent footsteps. The fluorescent lights above hummed with an almost mocking brightness, illuminating polished desks arranged in neat rows for real students. And as he wheeled to his assigned seat by the window, every eye in the room flicked to him with a slow, deliberate disdain, as though he were a stain on the floor that had to be stared at before anyone could look away. Miss Carlyle stood at the front, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line of contempt. Her eyes travelled the length of his body, over the spokes of his wheelchair, down to the battered cage in his hand, and for a moment he felt the weight of her gaze press into his bones. A ripple of snickers and coughs rolled through the room as she lifted a single brow. "Settle down," she commanded, voice crisp, but the undercurrent of amusement was unmistakable. "Mr. Harris, kindly park your animal and your act outside. This is a classroom, not a refuge for the disabled and the unwanted." She smirked as a boy 2 rows back mimed wiping drool from his lip, and a girl with perfectly curled hair tutted loudly. He lowered the parrot's cage onto the floor beside his desk, the metal rattling like a warning bell, and clipped its door open so the bird could perch on his shoulder. It ruffled its feathers defiantly, and Miss Carlyle's smirk flickered into a sneer. "That bird is filthy," she spat, striding down the aisle until she loomed over his desk like a guillotine waiting to drop. Without warning, she grabbed the cage and shook it, sending feathers fluttering through the stale air like mocking confetti. The parrot squawked in terror, beating its wings against the bars. "Do you call this therapy? Do you think your little pet makes you special? You're nothing but a spectacle, a sideshow for people like you who can't hack it in the real world." Her fingers tightened on the cage until metal scratched metal, and he winced, imagining the pressure on the bird's bones. Some students laughed, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to stop her. He stifled a cry as she flung the cage down onto the desk of an empty seat, the impact rattling notebooks. The parrot tumbled out, its tiny body skidding across the hard surface, feathers splayed like broken petals. He lunged forward, arms flailing, but she kicked the cage shut before he reached it, her heel slamming the metal latch with a finality that felt like a curse. The bird's soft cries echoed in the silent aftermath, and he bit back tears, fury twisting in his chest. Miss Carlyle planted her hands on her hips and glanced at the class, savouring the display. "Let that be a lesson. Rules apply to everyone, but especially to those who already think they're entitled. Now wheel yourself back to the front before I have you removed for disrupting the educational environment." She turned on her heel, heels clicking a countdown, and returned to her lectern as though nothing had happened. The students shuffled in their seats, some whispering, "He deserved it," others staring at the parrot's cage as though it were evidence in a crime scene. He pushed himself forward, the wheels grinding against the floor, and scooped the shaking bird into his arms, its soft body trembling with every beat of its heart. He perched it back on his shoulder, wrapping one hand around its wings to keep it steady, then wheeled himself to the front of the classroom, head bowed against the sting of humiliation. The bell rang, and the room erupted into chatter as if breaking a spell. But he stayed frozen, the parrot huddled against him like a living talisman. Miss Carlyle cleared her throat and resumed the lesson on 19th century poetry, her voice steady as a metronome while each syllable hammered at his mind. "You do not belong here. You do not belong anywhere you wish." The bird's muted whistles punctuated her words, a protest no one heard. As she wrote lines of verse on the board, boys behind him snickered and pointed. "Look at the little freak," and girls giggled. "Bet he can't even recite a poem without choking." The teacher shot a glance over her shoulder and smiled, a predator, admiring her kill. He sat motionless, arms trembling, jaws clenched so tight his teeth ached, and watched as the parrot leaned into him, its tiny beak nudging his cheek in a silent vow. "We survive." When the final bell rang, dismissing the class, he barely heard the whoops of relief around him. He gathered the cage, strapped it to his wheelchair, and rolled out into the hallway, flickering with overhead lights and fresh humiliation. Every glance from passing students was a reminder that his place had been contested and conquered once more. But the parrot's steady heartbeat on his shoulder echoed louder than their whispers, promising that this chapter was far from over. Let's take a brief pause. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and whether you've ever faced something similar in your own life. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We continue now. The crack in the facade. The hallway lights hummed overhead as he emerged from classroom 302. The weight of Miss Carlyle's contempt pressing on his shoulders like a physical thing. Every turn of his wheelchair carrying him deeper into a world that insisted he had no place in it. Students clustered at lockers glanced up only to smirk or whisper, fingers pointing at his parrot's cage as if it were a leper's bell, and their laughter trailed behind him in mocking waves while the harsh fluorescence etched every bruise and tear into stark relief. Outside the teacher's lounge, he paused as Ms. Aldridge, the English instructor, known for her clipped tone and pearl necklace, crossed the corridor. Her lips pursed as she regarded him with thinly veiled disgust. "I hope you taught that bird some manners today," she hissed so sharply that the words cut the air, and though no water basin loomed here to drench him, the sting of her bigotry felt wetter than any deluge, soaking into his skin, reminding him that every inch of this place rejected him. On the opposite wall, a group of cheerleaders practiced a chant, their voices bright but cruel. "Bones and feathers, tears and bleachers, he's a freak show, here we go." Each syllable hammered like a blow, each cheer a nail driven into the coffin of his dignity. He forced himself onward, the parrot perched on his shoulder, its feathers ruffled with fear but its eyes bright, as if daring the world to touch it again. He approached the administrative wing where rumours whispered like dry leaves. The principal would address the incident, they said. Discipline would follow, they promised. But he knew discipline here meant hollow words and perfunctory apologies that carried no weight for a black disabled boy or his terrified bird. He wheeled into the office vestibule and paused before the frosted glass door labelled Principal's Office, breath-catching as he recalled the promise of safety and authority that title should have implied. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. 2 deep breaths offered no solace. Before he tapped twice, a quiet plea for recognition. The door opened before he could hear a response, revealing Principal Buchanan's cavernous chamber, walls lined with plaques boasting academic excellence, trophies in glass cases that gleamed with institutional pride. Behind a polished oak desk she sat, her expression rigid, eyes narrowing beneath perfectly arched eyebrows. The room smelled of leather and coffee, but the chill in her gaze promised nothing warm. "Mr. Harris," she said slowly, voice laced with formality that barely hid contempt. "I understand you had an unfortunate incident." He inclined his head, offering no explanation, until she gestured to a chair that looked like it belonged in a funeral. Home, solid, unforgiving, lacking cushion, then turned back to her paperwork as though she'd already delivered his fate. He wheeled forward and settled into the chair, the metal armrests cold against his palms. The parrot squawked softly, nestling against him as if seeking comfort. Principal Buchanan finally looked up, lips thin. "It has come to my attention that you caused a disturbance in Miss Carlyle's class. Your request to bring an emotional support animal to school is not in compliance with district policy." Her meaning was clear. She blamed him. Not the teacher who doused him with water, who flung his parrot across the room. He felt anger coil within him but forced it down, knowing that any show of emotion would reinforce the stereotype she carried in her mind of a black boy unable to control himself. He cleared his throat. "She attacked me first," he began, voice quivering but firm. "She threw water on me, then she handled my parrot like it was filth." She raised a hand to silence him, eyes flicking to a gold-trimmed policy manual on her desk. "Mr. Harris, you must understand that actions have consequences. Disruption cannot be tolerated. Your accommodations were never properly filed. Had you followed the protocol, none of this would have occurred." The words dripped with condescension, as though he were an unruly child rather than a teenager whose resilience was tested daily by the intersections of racism and ableism. He opened his mouth to protest, but found Ms. Aldridge's earlier words ringing in his ears, the cheerleader's chant rattling his chest. Instead, he exhaled and met the principal's gaze. "Discipline me," he said softly. "I'll accept any consequence you choose, but you cannot ignore what she did." Silence stretched between them, a void filled with the unspoken truth that his principal would rather protect the reputation of her school and her staff than acknowledge the cruelty inflicted on him. The parrot let out a plaintive whistle, jolting her attention. She frowned. "That bird is a distraction," she stated. You may not bring it to school until proper authorization is granted. He pressed his lips together, spirit bruised by each demand for permission to breathe. Then you'll be telling me that living, struggling, and existing in your school is a disruption, he said, voice steady, though his heart thundered. She opened her mouth but closed it as if struck. The parrot squawked again, louder, its voice cutting through the veneer of decorum. For the first time, the principal's composure cracked, just a flicker, a rapid shutter click. And in that moment, he saw her fear. The fear of consequences, of scandal, of being exposed. He realized that no apology would come, no justice would be granted within these walls. He rose from the chair, each movement deliberate, and wheeled to the door. "I'll be back," he said. "This isn't over." The parrot's cry echoed as they exited, the door clicking shut behind them, and outside the corridor stretched long and bright, filled with faces turned away, with whispers that would echo beyond these halls. But in his chest, a spark had ignited, a promise that he would shatter the silence and force them to see him, and his parrot, as they truly were, living beings demanding to be heard, the public execution of dignity. The morning sunlight slanted through the cafeteria windows like a spotlight, illuminating every crumb and speck of dust on the tables. But the glare was nothing compared to the heat in Marcus's chest as he wheeled into the bustling room, typically a place of hurried breakfasts and casual chatter. Today it had been transformed into an arena, tables rearranged to form a crude stage before the serving line, and at the center stood Miss Carlyle, arms crossed, her lips curved into a satisfied smirk that promised persecution under fluorescent lights. She surveyed the gathered students, some whispering excitedly, others casting guilty glances, and raised her voice so that every pair of eyes settled on the boy in the wheelchair who clutched his parrot's cage tightly against his chest. "Attention, everyone!" she called, her tone dripping with theatrical disdain. "We have a visitor who seems to think that rules are optional for him and his little pet. Today, in the name of order and discipline, we will show him exactly where he belongs." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, metallic and sharpened by expectation. Marcus's palms slicked with sweat as he anchored the parrot's cage, the bird inside blinking up at him, its feathers still ruffled from yesterday's violence. He had known this could happen, that Miss Carlyle's cruelty would not stop behind classroom doors, but nothing could have prepared him for the chill that ran down his spine at her use of the word visitor, as if he were an intruder in a world that formally rejected him. At her signal, two of the cafeteria staff, pale-faced and reluctant, lifted a large plastic tub from a nearby cart, its interior dingy with old coffee stains and plastered with dried cereal bits. The parrot squawked at the sight, its tiny claws scrabbling against the bars. Marcus's throat tightened as one of the staff members dragged a folding chair from the stacked pile and positioned it in the center of the makeshift arena. He wheeled forward, every eye tracing his movement, the parrot's protests growing louder, a frantic staccato that seemed to plead for mercy. When he reached the chair, Miss Carlyle pointed, "Sit." The command was final. He obeyed, shutting his eyes as the chair scraped the floor, feeling every corridor tile's echo in his bones. The crowd's giggles sharpened into a sharp intake of breath. Anticipation for the show. Miss Carlyle snapped her fingers, and the cafeteria assistants hesitated only a moment before pouring the tub's contents over him. Warm water cascaded down his scalp, soaking the front of his shirt, darkening the fabric against his torso, and the shock of temperature against skin numb with anxiety nearly stole his breath. The parrot screeched so loudly that the room winced, its cries cutting through the laughter like a razor. Miss Carlyle leaned forward, her voice calm, yet cruel. "Let this remind you, Marcus, that you and your kind have no sanctuary here. You want to be seen? Fine. We'll see you." She turned to the amused students, gesturing broadly. "Isn't it nice to know no one is above the rules?" Some cheered, some stared in horrified silence, but Marcus didn't hear their reactions. He felt the weight of every droplet of water turning to shame as it seeped into his clothes, ran down his legs, puddling at his feet. The water soaked through the chair's seat and dripped down to the floor in dark rings like bruises. He lowered his head, focusing on the parrot's frantic movement in its cage, the tiny body trembling with terror. Then, with a sudden clarity that pierced the humiliation, he reached into his pocket, withdrew his phone, and hit record. The red dot blinked defiantly as the camera captured every moment. Miss Carlyle towering over him, the staff members relieving themselves of responsibility under her direction, the students' faces, some gleeful, some shamefaced, reflected in the polished linoleum. Even as the water continued to pour, Marcus held the phone steady, his fingers numb but determined. Miss Carlyle noticed the device. Her eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat, the confident mask slipped, revealing fear beneath the contempt. She barked an order, "Stop that!" But her voice wavered, and the students turned to watch the phone's screen instead of the drenched boy. Murmurs rose. "Are you filming this?" And a larger question hung in the air. Was it real or performance? The parrot's cries became a lament, shaking itself in the cage, feathers glistening with droplets. At that moment, Principal Buchanan stepped into the cafeteria, summoned, no doubt, by the crescendo of noise. She paused at the entrance, her tailored jacket immaculate, her expression unreadable. The entire room stilled as she surveyed the scene. Marcus clinging to his phone, water streaming from his hair, his parrot shivering in its cage, students and staff frozen in tableau. Miss Carlyle straightened, trying to recover her composure. Principal Buchanan's voice, cold and precise, cut through the air. "Enough." The single word rolled over the crowd like a judge's gavel. The tub was lifted away, the last trickle of water hitting the floor with a final splatter. Marcus lowered his arm, the phone's record light still blinking. He looked up, meeting the principal's eyes. In that locked gaze, he saw the recognition that she could neither deny nor fully condemn. There was a flicker, an acknowledgement of power slipping from her grip. The cafeteria assistants looked away. The students shifted uncomfortably. Buchanan stepped forward, every inch the authority she was meant to embody, and surveyed Miss Carlyle with a measured, damning silence. Then she turned to Marcus. "Mr. Harris, are you injured?" His voice was dry, controlled. "No, ma'am." She nodded once, as though marking a point on an invisible ledger, then addressed the entire room. "This school has policies against harassment and bullying. They apply to everyone. We will be conducting a full investigation." Another pause, this one pregnant with the promise of accountability. Marcus lowered his head and stopped the recording, capturing the final still of water streaming from his sleeve. The parrot's feathers splayed in anxious defiance, and the principal's rigid silhouette against the cafeteria lights. As he wheeled away, students now parted silently, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by a hush heavy with uncertainty. Miss Carlyle stood motionless, the weight of unspoken blame pressing on her. For the first time, the facade of authority showed cracks, her carefully constructed world trembling under the glare of a phone camera's unblinking eye. Outside the cafeteria doors, the hallway lights offered a path to escape, but Marcus's resolve burned hotter than shame. He realized that this wasn't just about him, or his parrot, or a single teacher's cruelty. It was about exposing the rot beneath the polished veneer of the institution, and as he rolled into the corridor, water dripping onto the floor in a trail of silent testimony, he knew he held the power to make them remember this moment long after the water dried, and long after they wished they could forget. The gathering storm in the halls. As dawn broke over the school's red brick facade, the corridors already thrummed with whispers of yesterday's spectacle, tempered by anger and fear in equal measure. And when Marcus wheeled into the lobby, the tiled floor seemed colder, as if the building had frozen in anticipation of the next act in its tragedy. Students turned their heads quickly, some crossing themselves as though warding off evil, others lowering their eyes in shame, and even the janitor paused mid-sweep, broom poised, reluctant to disturb the tension hanging in the fluorescent air. He pushed on, Parrot's cage strapped firmly to his lap, its small form rattling with every revolution of his wheels, and he smelled the faint tang of antiseptic from a nearby nurse's station, a reminder that rules had been broken and bodies pushed to their limits. In his path, Mary Ellen Turner, the head cheerleader, halted her squad's morning chants and tightened the circle, her lips pursed in a practiced veneer of sympathy that barely concealed triumph. "He's back already," she whispered loudly enough for Marcus to hear. "Bet he thinks the principal's promise means he can storm the halls with his filthy bird again. I heard they'll expel him if he tries to disrupt one more time." The cheerleaders laughed softly, a cold, precise sound like snapping ice, and Marcus felt the heat of their mockery as though it were flame against his skin. Across the lobby, Mr. Green, the vice principal, emerged from his office in a crisp grey suit, briefcase in hand, and features set in an expression neither welcoming nor entirely hostile, but ready to wield policy like a cudgel. Their eyes met for a single charged heartbeat before he dipped his head and signalled for Marcus to come forward. The parrot let out a sharp squawk, and a cluster of students backed away as though afraid the bird's defiance might summon retribution from above. "Mr. Harris," the vice principal intoned, voice flat as stone, "we need to discuss the conditions of your continued attendance. Please proceed to the conference room." He led the way through a labyrinth of corridors, peeling paint and outdated bulletin boards filled with crumpled flyers for clubs that had folded years ago, and with each turn, Marcus sensed the distance between him and any semblance of normalcy stretch a little farther. He paused at a stained glass window depicting the school's emblem, the words knowledge, integrity, respect, etched beneath a torch, and he spat in silence at the hypocrisy it represented. The conference room's door closed behind him with a pneumatic sigh that felt ominous, as though sealing him in a chamber of judgment. Inside, a half circle of administrators and counsellors waited. Mr. Green, Ms. Baker, the school psychologist with her clipboard and clinical gaze, Coach Reynolds in his whistle-laden tracksuit, and worst of all, Miss Carlyle, seated at the far end as though she were the honoured guest rather than the accused. Her lips curved in satisfaction when she saw him enter. The bird's cage scooted to the edge of the table like a token of her victory. Ms. Baker tapped her pen. "Thank you for coming, Marcus. We know this has been difficult for you, but we need to review everyone's perspective." She glanced at Miss Carlyle, who straightened and folded her hands primly. "Indeed, we must ensure a learning environment free of distraction." "Distraction?" Marcus cut in, voice low and steady. "I was humiliated in front of my peers. My bird was thrown. I didn't disrupt learning. I was disrupted." A shiver ran through the room like an electrical current. Miss Carlyle's eyes flashed, but she remained silent. Coach Reynolds cleared his throat. "Rules are rules," he said gruffly, "and your unauthorized animal and behavior forced us to act." Ms. Baker nodded. "We're here to find a resolution that respects both the school's policies and your needs." The word respect hung in the air, as hollow as the cracked trophy cases lining the walls. Marcus leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "My accommodation request was lost in your bureaucracy. My bird is part of my therapy. You showed no respect for my disability or for my identity when you doused me with water and called me a spectacle." His words cut to the heart of the room, and for once no one laughed. Mr. Green cleared his throat. "We understand your perspective, but the school must uphold safety and decorum. We propose a modified schedule. You will arrive early to avoid crowded hallways. Your classes will be relocated to rooms away from high-traffic areas, and the bird must remain in a designated support zone, not in general classrooms." The proposed restrictions felt like chains. Ms. Baker added, "We can arrange counselling sessions to help you cope with the stress of these events." Marcus's breath hitched. A counsellor who would be told to help him manage his reaction to their cruelty. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze settling on Miss Carlyle last. Her face was unreadable, her smug satisfaction replaced by a guarded caution. He nodded slowly. "I will comply, but know this. I am not the one who needs fixing." The room exhaled, as though relieved he had accepted their terms, and Coach Reynolds leaned back, tapping his shoes against the table. "Good. We'll draft the agreement immediately." As they rose, Marcus gathered the cage and wheeled toward the door, but Ms. Baker called out, "Marcus, one more thing." He stopped and turned. "Yes?" She hesitated, pen hovering above her clipboard. "We'd like you to share your experience with a student panel. It could promote understanding." His lips pressed into a thin line. Student panel. A show trial where he would be forced to relive his trauma for the amusement of peers who thought themselves enlightened. He shook his head. "No. Voices around the table murmured, some concerned, some disappointed. Ms. Baker sighed. Very well. He exited into the corridor, shoulders rigid, and paused as a group of teachers passed by. Ms. Turner shooing away whispers, Mr. Adams crossing the hallway with averted gaze, and he realized the entire building recoiled at his presence. Outside the conference room, the Parrot let out a low whistle, its small body leaning against him, and for the first time he felt its weight as solidarity instead of burden. They wheeled through the halls, bathed in fluorescent light that felt colder than winter's dawn, and he heard the echo of every insult, every jeer, every whispered threat of, "You don't belong here," that still rang in his ears. He knew he stood at the eye of the storm, policies and people swirling around him like debris. Yet as he passed the trophy cases, their dusty glass reflecting his determined face, he felt a spark of defiance ignite in his chest. The world might try to contain him, silence him, humble him, but he would not vanish. He would become the storm itself, unrelenting and unbowed, until the truth of his existence shattered their illusions and forced them to see him, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as a human being deserving of dignity. And in that moment of clarity, Marcus wheeled toward the student services exit, Parrot at his side, ready to confront every barrier they placed before him, knowing that the fight was far from over, and that the halls of the school would never be the same again. The boardroom's unseen queen. The hallway beyond the conference room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves recoiled from the truth Marcus carried with him. And yet there was no relief from the stifling glare of fluorescent lights, nor from the murmured glances that darted away the moment he passed. He wheeled toward the counselor's suite, each turn of the wheels a testament to his resolve, when a voice stopped him in his tracks. Soft, measured, carrying a note of authority that cut through the haze of administrative condescension. Marcus. He looked up into the face of the woman who had commanded policy meetings and set code of conduct across the district. His mother, Dr. Evelyn Harris, long seated on the school board behind closed doors, her presence in this wing unheard of until now. She wore power like a second skin, tailored suit, pearl earrings, eyes that missed nothing, and though her smile was gentle, it carried the weight of every fight she had ever won for civil rights. A silence fell around them so heavy that a pin dropped would have sounded like an avalanche, and the students waiting in the lobby ceased their whispers. Marcus closed his eyes, heart pounding, wonder mingled with dread. His mother was a champion of justice, but here she was, summoned by scandal, yet unknown to the very people she oversaw. "Mother," he whispered, voice thick with relief and fragmentation. She knelt beside his wheelchair, voice soft but unyielding. They crossed a line today that they never expected to challenge. Behind her, the glass door to the boardroom slid open, and administrators spilled into the corridor. Mr. Green's face pale, Miss Baker's lips pursed, Coach Reynolds shifting uncomfortably, and worst of all, Miss Carlyle posited at the edge of the cluster, arms folded, rage tightening her jaw. "Evelyn," Mr. Green stammered, "we weren't aware." She straightened, every inch the composed arbiter of law and policy, and directed a glance at her son. The Parrot on Marcus's lap let out a tentative whistle, its feathers bristling like a banner of solidarity. The crowd parted, anticipation crackling in the air like electricity. "You know who I am," she said, voice low enough that only those closest could hear, yet it resonated down the hall. "I see what happened to him, and I see your cowardice in turning away." Miss Carlyle's face shifted, her mask of superiority wavering for the first time. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, struck by the realization that the rules she had wielded so gleefully now bound her in a chokehold of accountability. "Doctor." Harris raised a hand and addressed the group as though they were a classroom of unruly students. "Discrimination and humiliation are not policy enforcement. They are crimes against humanity. You chose to weaponize your positions against a vulnerable child because of his race and his disability, and you believed no one would hold you to account." The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. Behind them, students gathered at the ends of the corridor, phones raised, recording the reckoning they had only dared to hope for. Miss Carlyle's eyes flicked to the camera lights, and panic flashed across her features. "He violated procedure," she sputtered. Don't justify your hatred with procedure, Dr. Harris interrupted, stepping forward, her presence massive as an oncoming storm. You assaulted him with water. You threw his bird as though it were garbage. You laughed as you stripped him of dignity in front of his peers. Now you will face a board hearing, and I will ensure that every member sees exactly what you have done. Mr. Green swallowed, his authority evaporating beneath Dr. Harris's gaze. Coach Reynolds shifted, guilt marring his features. Ms. Baker closed her notebook, her professional detachment crumbling into shame. Meanwhile, the students' whispers swelled into cheers, a wave of solidarity washing over the stunned administrators. The parrot let out a triumphant cry, and Marcus felt the ferocity of life thrumming beneath its tiny chest. Miss Carlyle backed away, flanked by the hushed crowd, her defiance shriveling under Dr. Harris's unwavering stare. The corridor itself seemed to tilt, the facade of the school cracking open to reveal the rot within. Dr. Harris reached out and touched her son's shoulder. "You did exactly what was right, Marcus," she said, voice thick with a mother's pride and sorrow. "You refused to vanish, and now they cannot make you invisible again." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes as the magnitude of the moment washed over him. The power of a mother's love leveraged through institutional might, the humiliation of a cruel teacher undone by the unveiling of hidden authority, and the promise that this storm would not pass until every last drop of injustice had been exposed. In that unbroken stretch of corridor, where whispers and applause collided, the world shifted on its axis, and Marcus realized that the walls that once cowered at his presence would never be the same again. The storm had arrived, and it carried a truth that no policy could suppress. In the days that followed the boardroom confrontation, the school transformed into a pressure cooker of whispered rumors and open stares, as if the walls themselves had learned to judge. Corridors that once rang with idle chatter now simmered with tension so thick you could taste it in the air, and every time Marcus passed, the hush deepened, broken only by the soft, indignant whistle of his parrot echoing through empty classrooms. Teachers who had turned a blind eye to Miss Carlyle's cruelty now exchanged furtive glances, shuffling papers and clearing their throats when he approached, as though proximity to her victim risked contagion. Parents streamed into the building, some clutching coffee cups like shields, others clutching petitions demanding Miss Carlyle's immediate removal, her name scrawled in angry marker across sheets of notebook paper. In the cafeteria, a row of empty seats bore witness to the administrative exile that Marcus's accommodations had wrought upon him. Teachers refused to sit beside him, their lunches carried away in lidded cups so no crumbs might taint their presence. Yet the parrot, perched on his shoulder like a warrior's standard, refused to be silenced, its feathers still ruffled with outrage, and its indignant cries punctuated the ritualized condescension that followed him through every hallway. Even students who had once mocked him now nodded in pity or shame, their whispers growing bolder. "I heard she's been suspended pending investigation. They're tearing up her maps of lesson plans. Imagine how humiliated she'll be when they air the footage." But in the teacher's lounge, Miss Carlyle sat alone at a lunch table, her tray of untouched food pushed aside as gossip buzzed like flies around her resignation letter. Drafted, discarded, redrafted, under the weight of her own pride and denial. She scrawled lines on a scrap of yellow paper, each one a justification, that Marcus had provoked her, that rules were rules, that her actions were no different than maintaining order. Yet above her desk, the principal's memorandum posted, public censure in bold letters, broadcasting the charges of abuse of authority and harassment of a disabled student for all to see. Outside the front office window, local news crews parked satellite vans with their neon signs glaring in the morning sun. Reporters hurrying inside to corroborate every detail, their microphones thrust into the faces of horrified students and trembling faculty, capturing conflicting testimonies that painted Miss Carlyle alternately as a witch hunt victim and an opportunistic bully. In the hallways, walls once adorned with student art suddenly sprouted posters demanding justice for Marcus, with photocopies of his soaked uniform and the parrot's bedraggled feathers, symbols of defiance in a school that had tried to drown them. As the investigation deepened, district officials convened panels of attorneys and psychologists who pored over policy manuals and disability statutes. But the more they dissected legal minutiae, the more the school's long-suppressed undercurrent of racism and ableism bled to the surface. Whispered jokes in the break room about those people who make special demands, a guidance counselor muttering that the system is being gamed, and an assistant principal caught on camera removing the petition for Miss Carlyle's ouster from a bulletin board, replacing it with a sign-up sheet for a fundraiser, an act that only amplified the outrage. Against this backdrop, Marcus's once quiet life became an endless cycle of formal meetings, media interviews, and restorative justice circles that felt less like healing and more like a spotlight fixed on his pain. He sat hour after hour in conference rooms where adults debated his grievances like they were case studies, dissecting his emotions under fluorescent lights, while the parrot, confined to its cage on the table, peered out with bright, accusing eyes. Students circled like witnesses waiting to testify, some drawn by curiosity, others by solidarity, each encounter underscored by microaggressions. A locker slammed as he passed, a teacher pausing mid-lecture to clear the chalkboard of his name, a coach muttering that discipline must be maintained. Yet through it all, he felt the tremor of a shifting tide as more voices joined his cause, students of every race who recalled their own moments of exclusion, parents who remembered attending, schools where difference invited derision, even faculty members who confessed that they had closed their eyes when witnessing cruelty. On the final day of the formal inquiry, as the review board gathered in the auditorium, rows of folding chairs filled with witnesses and supporters, and the accused, separated by a lone podium, the principal pressed play on a projector, and the video of Miss Carlyle's water dousing flickered to life on the white screen. The parrot's frantic cries haunting the playback. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the teacher's once unshakable composure crumbling with each replay, her mouth opening and closing as though she sought words that would redeem her. When the footage ended, silence fell like a hammer blow, and the board chair, a stern-faced woman in a navy suit, cleared her throat before pronouncing the verdict. Immediate termination for gross misconduct and recommendation for mandatory training on anti-bias and disability inclusion. Miss Carlyle's voice caught as she stammered an apology that trembled with resentment, her eyes darting to the parrot's cage where Marcus sat, shoulders squared, the bird's feathers fluffed like victory ribbons. Outside, the crow was relentless. Cheers erupted, cameras clicked, and students surged forward carrying signs that read, "Dignity denied no more," and "Black and disabled lives matter." But in the aftermath of her downfall, even Marcus felt the bitter sting of betrayal, knowing that Miss Carlyle's removal could not erase the scars etched into his memory, nor repair the trust shattered between him and an institution that had once promised sanctuary. As he wheeled out of the auditorium, the parrot's triumphant whistle echoing through the empty halls, he understood that this victory was only the opening salvo in a far larger battle, one that would challenge every hidden prejudice, every cloaked insult, and every institution willing to sacrifice humanity at the altar of conformity. And in that moment, as the doors slid shut behind him, he resolved to speak not just for himself, but for every voice silenced by fear, ensuring that this school, and every place that prized appearances above justice, would never again mistake cruelty for order. The uproar that couldn't be contained. The boardroom's blinds had barely clicked shut when word of Miss Carlyle's termination spread beyond the auditorium like wildfire, and by the next morning, the school's facade of calm was ripped away to reveal a seething maelstrom of outrage and solidarity spilling into the streets. Parents with clipboards and coffee cups clustered at the iron gates, their voices rising in chants of "Justice for Marcus," banners spraying college-ruled words across twisted cardboard, "No more hate in our halls," "Respect disabled Black lives," while on the opposite corner, a group of angry protesters held signs of another hue, accusing the board of caving to political correctness and promising to march until the UMATAMB principal's resignation followed the teachers. Radio trucks with blinking lights lined the curb as camera crews jockeyed for position, microphones thrust toward dripping spokes of the wheelchair and the trembling parrot that Marcus carried into the chaos like a talisman. His mother, still donning her board lanyard, moved through the crowd with measured quiet, but eyes that blazed with purpose, deflecting interviews from reporters who demanded sound bites, who tried to twist his pain into scandalous gossip. From one angle, Marcus's shattered confidence sat bare in the glare of relentless attention. Boys who had once mocked him now held up their phones to record his every gesture. Mothers approached him with tears in their eyes, strangers pressed sandwiches into his hands, and survivors of other injustices shared their own stories in a rush of confessions that made him feel both comforted and overwhelmed. Yet for every voice raised in empathy, there was another filled with venom. Anonymous callers left threats on voicemail, accusing him of playing the victim, of destroying a teacher's career, and warning that this school will never be safe again. A smear campaign erupted online with hashtags meant to tarnish his reputation. Traitor teen, bird boy scandal, each false rumor spreading faster than wildfire, each caricature aimed at reducing him to a stereotype. Even some teachers who had privately condemned Miss Carlyle now whispered that Marcus had exaggerated the events, that the water dowsing was just discipline, and that the bird was his own responsibility. In the cafeteria, where only days ago he'd been drenched and mocked, a new arrangement of seating left an entire table empty for him, and an escort volunteer who guided him to a podium to address the student body. The auditorium's once steady scent of stage polish now reeked of sweat and uncertainty as he rolled forward. The parrot perched calmly on his shoulder, its eyes reflecting both fear and fierce pride. The murmurs died when he opened his mouth, voice trembling but firm. "You saw me humiliated. You saw her cruelty. But today I stand here because I am stronger than your hate." His words echoed through the charged silence like thunder, cracking the hardened shells of indifference. An unexpected cheer swelled, drowning out the handful of boos from those who still clung to bigotry. He spoke of every moment of shame, of cold water streaking his skin, of feathers fallen like innocence, of the hush that greeted him in every hallway. And he held nothing back. The sting of every racist slur, the razor-sharp edge of every mocking laugh, the way the world tried to convince him his life was an inconvenience. As he spoke, flashes of solidarity flickered on the faces around him. A Muslim classmate recalling harassment over her hijab, a student athlete recounting a torn ACL and the jealousy he'd faced for using crutches too, a teacher who admitted she had turned her head when she should have intervened. One by one they rose behind him, forming a living wall of shared vulnerability that no amount of policy could dismantle. Outside the school, the local news broadcast the assembly live, and callers flooded into radio talk shows arguing the morality of protecting a child who carried a parrot, while unsuspecting elders yelled about unruly youths. Yet as the storm of opinions raged on, a group of student journalists uploaded a short documentary titled Marcus's Story, weaving footage of the cafeteria incident with his testimony and interviews of allies. And within hours, it had been shared tens of thousands of times across social feeds. The parrot, its chest puffed in proud defiance, became an emblem of resilience, its image splashed across memes and profile pictures accompanied by slogans like "Feathers for Freedom" and "Squawk Out Injustice." Even the school's board website, hastily stripped of its pristine design, displayed a ticker announcing policy reviews and commitments to diversity training. But beneath every public statement lay the raw ache of betrayal. For every parent who stood with him, another plotted legal action against the board. For every teacher who apologized, another whispered that Marcus's win would embolden troublemakers. The swirl of hate and hope pressed in from every direction until Marcus feared his spirit would shatter under its weight. Late that evening, when the last of the protesters had dispersed and the lights in the school windows dimmed, he and his mother returned to the near-empty auditorium. He wheeled onto the stage, the wooden floor creaking as if complaining of his presence, and looked out into the hushed seats where no one sat. The parrot's soft whistled cry broke the silence, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice a gentle anchor in the storm. "This is far from over, Marcus. The world is watching and waiting." He nodded, feeling the hard truth settle in his chest. That victory was never a single moment, but a series of battles, each one testing the limits of courage and compassion. As he wheeled toward the wings, The stage lights flickered one last time, and in their glow he saw reflected not just his own battered form, but the faces of everyone who had refused to look away. And though the road ahead promised more pain, more prejudice, and more trials, he understood at that instant that he would carry the parrot's defiance and his mother's fierce love as armor against the looming darkness, the shattered sunrise of victory. The morning light filtered through the cracked windows of the auditorium, turning every speck of dust into a dancing witness as Marcus wheeled onto the empty stage for the final reckoning of his ordeal, his parrot perched on his shoulder like a steadfast sentinel against the darkness that had threatened to drown them both. Behind him lay the echoes of boardroom battles, media storms, and the bitter taste of false apologies. And before him stretched the fragile promise of a new day, trembling on the edge of hope and despair. As he positioned himself at the podium, his fingers slackened around the cage's handles, feeling the faint heartbeat of his companion beneath his palm. A reminder that even in the ruin of innocence, life persisted. He cleared his throat and raised his eyes to the rows of empty seats, imagining every face that had shaped his journey. The sneers of classmates who dubbed him Bird Boy with cruel delight, the cold dismissal of teachers who hid behind policy, the indignant applause of parents who saw his pain as entertainment, and the unwavering determination of his mother, Dr. Harris, who had wielded authority like a sword to carve a path for justice. In that pregnant silence, the weight of all he had endured pooled in his chest like molten lead. Each drop of water in the cafeteria that had soaked into his uniform, every mocking whisper that branded him as less than, every administration meeting where his disability was framed as an inconvenience, they all coalesced into a single truth: he had survived. "Today," he began, voice steady despite the tremor beneath, "I stand not just for myself, but for every child who has been told they do not belong, for every voice that has been drowned in the name of order, and for every spirit crushed by those who wield power without compassion." His words rolled across the empty hall, each syllable a hammer blow against the complacency that had allowed cruelty to flourish. He paused, and in that pause the auditorium seemed to inhale, the silence thick with remembrance of every injustice he had laid bare. The parrot let out a soft whistle, its feathers ruffling in solidarity, and Marcus's throat tightened as he continued. "When Ms. Carlyle hurled me into humiliation, she taught me that blind adherence to rules can become a weapon. When the principal demanded I seek permission to exist, she taught me that institutions protect themselves before people, but they underestimated one thing: a child's will to live with dignity." He drew a breath heavy with sorrow and defiance, his eyes glinting with unshed tears. "I will not forget the color of water that fell on my skin, nor the sight of my parrot's wings battered in captivity. I will not forget the echo of laughter that tried to drown my voice, but I will use that memory as fuel for change." Behind the stage lights, the emptiness of the hall no longer felt hollow. It brimmed with potential, a canvas awaiting the strokes of every story longing to be heard. Marcus tilted his head, listening to the faint hum of the building's bones. And in that ambient symphony, he heard the stirrings of transformation, whispers of solidarity among students, confessions of guilt from teachers who had turned away, and the tremulous promise of policies rewritten to protect rather than punish difference. As he stepped down from the podium, the parrot took flight in a graceful arc, its wings catching the morning glow, and landed on his shoulder once more, its beak nudging his cheek in a gesture of unwavering companionship. In that moment, the walls of the auditorium dissolved, replaced by the boundless horizon of possibility. Yet even as triumph shimmered on the edge of dawn, Marcus carried a deeper sorrow, the knowledge that victory often comes wrapped in scars that never fully heal. He wheeled toward the exit, every turn of the wheel a testament to resilience, and paused at the threshold. "This is not the end," he called back to the empty seats that had become his confessional. "It is only the beginning." The doors swung open to reveal the world beyond, streets still echoing with the aftermath of protests, classrooms reeling from revelations, hearts opening and closing in equal measure. And as Marcus and his parrot passed, into the first rays of sunlight, the school behind them stood forever changed, its legacy rewritten by a boy who refused to be erased, and by a feathered friend whose defiant cry would echo in its halls long after the final chapter had been written. Let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism in your own life? Your experiences matter deeply to us, and we value each one of you more than words can express. If you're still with us to the very end, type, "I stand against hate," so we know you listened all the way through. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like. Have a good day.